January 1945, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The winter sun filtered through the barbed wire fence in pale golden streams, casting long shadows across the frost-touched grass of the prisoner of war compound. A convoy of military trucks rumbled through the main gate, their canvas covers flapping in the cold wind that swept down from the Appalachian foothills. Inside those trucks sat 47 German women, their gray Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms wrinkled and stained from weeks of ocean crossing, their faces gaunt and expressionless. They had been Nachrichtenhilferinnen, signals auxiliaries, captured during the collapse of German positions in France, now transported across an ocean to a land they had been taught to despise, to a people they had been told were culturally barbaric, racially mongrelized, and spiritually hollow. As the trucks came to a halt before the processing barracks, the women climbed down stiffly, their boots crunching on the gravel. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, touched with pine and something else they could not quite identify, something that suggested abundance rather than the acrid smoke of bombed cities and burning refineries they had left behind. An American sergeant, a middle-aged woman in crisp uniform, gestured toward the intake facility. Her face held neither hostility nor sympathy, only the practiced neutrality of someone following established protocol. But what struck the German women most was not the sergeant's expression. It was the sight behind her, through the open door of what appeared to be a mess hall. Trays upon trays of food, more food than they had seen in a single place in 3 years of war. And among those trays, something that looked like bread topped with melted cheese and red sauce, steam rising from its surface in the cool Georgia air. That evening, each woman received a metal tray bearing portions that would have fed a family for 2 days in the Germany they had left. There was meat, actual meat, not the sawdust-extended horse meat they had grown accustomed to. There were vegetables, canned but recognizable, white bread, soft and impossibly white, and there on a separate plate, a triangular slice of what the American servers called pizza pie. Most of the women stared at it with suspicion bordering on revulsion. The bread was thick, oily, covered with an excessive amount of melted cheese that stretched in long strings when pulled. The tomato sauce looked garish, almost violent in its redness, and the whole construction seemed to embody everything their propaganda had warned them about American excess, American vulgarity, American lack of refinement. This was not food as they understood it. This was waste made edible, abundance without elegance, quantity over quality. Several women refused to touch it entirely. Others took experimental bites and grimaced, setting their forks down with thinly disguised disgust. Obergefreiter Marguerite Hoffmann, 23 years old, formerly stationed at a communications outpost near St. Lo, stared at the pizza slice on her tray as if it were a personal insult. She had grown up in Stuttgart, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a civil engineer, raised in a household where meals followed strict protocols of proportion and presentation. Even during the war, even as rations tightened and quality declined, German military food had maintained a certain orderliness. Thin soups carefully seasoned, dark bread sliced precisely, potatoes boiled until tender but not mushy. This American concoction violated every principle of culinary civilization she had been taught. The cheese was too abundant, the crust too thick, the whole affair too casual in its construction. She took one bite, tasted the heavy saltiness, the overwhelming richness, and pushed the plate away. Around her, other women made similar gestures of rejection, their faces communicating a shared conclusion. This was exactly what they expected from America: loud, excessive, unrefined, and ultimately unsatisfying. What none of them understood yet, what none of them could have understood in that first evening behind American barbed wire, was that their reaction to a simple slice of pizza represented something far more profound than culinary preference. It was the collision of two entirely different philosophies of existence, two incompatible visions of what society should provide its people, two opposing answers to the fundamental question of what made life worth living. The women who arrived at Fort Oglethorpe in January 1945 had been shaped by more than 6 years of National Socialist indoctrination and 4 years of total war. They were products of a system that had promised to restore German greatness through sacrifice, discipline, and collective submission to the will of the state. They had been members of the Nachrichtenhelferin Corps, female communications specialists who operated telephone exchanges, decoded messages, and maintained radio equipment for Wehrmacht units. Unlike male prisoners, who comprised the vast majority of German POWs held in the United States, these women occupied a strange liminal space in the machinery of captivity. They were soldiers but not combatants, prisoners but not enemies in the traditional sense, women in a war that had progressively blurred every boundary between military and civilian, between front line and home front. The journey that brought them to Georgia had begun in the chaos of the Normandy collapse, when Allied forces overran German communication posts faster than personnel could be evacuated. Most had been captured in groups, their units surrendering en masse as the Wehrmacht's defensive positions disintegrated. They had spent weeks in temporary camps in France and England before being loaded onto Liberty ships for the Atlantic crossing. That voyage had been their first direct encounter with American material capacity. The ships themselves were marvels of industrial production, vessels constructed in weeks rather than months, part of an assembly line process that churned out more tonnage than German U-boats could ever hope to sink. Below decks, even as prisoners, they had been fed 3 times daily, given access to medical care, treated according to protocols established by the Geneva Convention with a bureaucratic precision that somehow seemed more German than American. But the women themselves did not understand what they were seeing because their entire worldview had been constructed to explain away such evidence. Nazi ideology had provided them with comprehensive answers to questions they had never thought to ask. Why were Germany's cities being reduced to rubble while American cities remained untouched? Because Americans fought without honor, bombing civilians while refusing to accept battle on equal terms. Why did American forces possess unlimited ammunition, vehicles, and supplies, while German units scraped together the remnants of destroyed equipment? Because Americans were materialistic, unable to match German spiritual strength with anything but brute industrial capacity. Why did American soldiers seem so casual, so undisciplined, so unmilitary in their bearing? Because they were the products of a mongrel democracy, a nation without true culture, without the binding force of racial consciousness and collective will. This ideological framework had been reinforced through every institution of Nazi society. The Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, had taught them from childhood that German women possessed special qualities that made them essential to racial preservation. They were to be mothers of the master race, guardians of cultural purity, living embodiments of feminine virtue in service to the state. When war came and the regime needed their labor, the rhetoric adapted but never abandoned its core premise. Women served Germany by maintaining the infrastructure that allowed men to fight. By operating communications equipment, they were not becoming unfeminine. They were extending their natural nurturing role to encompass the care and feeding of the military machine itself. The food they had eaten throughout the war years had been shaped by these ideological considerations as much as by material scarcity. Nazi nutrition policy emphasized communal sacrifice as a demonstration of collective commitment. The Winter Relief Program had popularized one-pot meals, Eintopf, simple stews designed to use minimal resources while feeding maximum numbers. Citizens were expected to embrace these meals not as deprivation, but as participation in national solidarity. Propaganda films showed German families cheerfully eating thin vegetable soup, their contentment presented as evidence of spiritual fulfillment that transcended material conditions. By 1943, as Allied bombing devastated German cities and food production collapsed, ration cards allocated calories with scientific precision, 1,800 per day for non-manual workers, slightly more for those engaged in heavy labor, carefully calibrated amounts of protein and fat designed to maintain minimum health while preventing waste. The women arriving at Fort Oglethorpe had internalized this ethos of disciplined scarcity. Many genuinely believed that abundant food represented moral weakness, that a society offering its people unlimited choices in cuisine was a society that had lost its way, that true strength came from the ability to endure privation without complaint. The pizza they rejected in that first meal was not just unfamiliar food, it was a symbol of everything wrong with American civilization. But something changed in the weeks that followed, something subtle and profound that none of the women would have admitted even to themselves. The pizza kept appearing on the meal rotation every Thursday evening, served alongside other Italian-American dishes that the Fort Oglethorpe kitchen staff prepared with the same casual efficiency they brought to everything. Spaghetti with meat sauce, baked ziti, chicken parmesan. The cooks were mostly Italian-American men from the Northeast, drafted into service and assigned to feed prisoners, because their culinary skills were more valuable than their combat potential. They prepared these meals without particular artistry, but with a certain workmanlike competence, following recipes they knew from family restaurants and neighborhood pizzerias, scaling them up to feed hundreds with the resources of an American military supply chain that never seemed to run dry. The women's initial disgust slowly transformed into reluctant curiosity. Hunger was part of it, certainly. Even American excess eventually becomes appealing when you are genuinely hungry, and the portions of other foods, while generous by German standards, were not unlimited. But more than hunger, there was the undeniable fact that the other prisoners, the Italian POWs who had been at Fort Oglethorpe since 1943, approached pizza night with genuine enthusiasm. The Italian men would line up early, joking with the servers in broken English mixed with Italian dialect, their faces lighting up when they received their portions. They ate with evident pleasure, not the grim efficiency of people fueling their bodies, but the relaxed enjoyment of people experiencing genuine satisfaction. Marguerite Hoffman watched this spectacle with growing confusion. She had been taught that Italians were weak, that their military collapse proved the inferiority of their national character, that they lacked the Germanic qualities of discipline and endurance. Yet here they were, these allegedly weak men, maintaining better morale than many of the German prisoners, adapting to captivity with a flexibility that seemed less like weakness than wisdom. And their enthusiasm for this crude, excessive food seemed connected somehow to their broader attitude toward life, as if the ability to take pleasure in simple things was not a character flaw but a survival mechanism, a way of remaining human under dehumanizing circumstances. The second Thursday, Marguerite ate half her pizza slice before pushing it away. The third Thursday she finished it entirely, though without particular enthusiasm. By the fourth Thursday something had shifted. She found herself noticing details she had missed before, the way the cheese browned at the edges, developing a slight bitterness that balanced the sweetness of the tomato sauce. The way the crust had two distinct textures, crispy on the bottom, soft and chewy where it met the toppings. The way the grease from the cheese pooled in small circles on the surface, catching the fluorescent light from the mess hall ceiling. These were not profound observations, but they represented a crack in her ideological armor, a moment when sensory experience trumped programmed response. Other women underwent similar transformations, each at her own pace, each with her own internal justifications. Some claimed they were simply tired of resisting, that it was easier to eat what was provided than to maintain constant vigilance. Others insisted they still found it disgusting, but were forcing themselves to consume calories for health reasons. A few began to admit, quietly in conversations that remained private, that perhaps American food was not as uniformly terrible as they had been led to believe. None of them used the word enjoy, not yet, but the quality of their resistance had changed. They were no longer rejecting the food as a moral statement. They were simply eating it, allowing it to become normalized, ordinary, no longer worthy of special attention or disgust. The transformation in attitude toward pizza mirrored a larger transformation in how these women understood their captivity itself. Fort Oglethorpe was not what they had expected. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for concentration camp conditions, for brutal treatment by guards, for systematic abuse designed to break their spirits. They had been told that Americans, especially American soldiers, were essentially criminal in nature, that the facade of civilization would drop away once Germans were at their mercy. Instead, they found themselves in a facility that operated according to rules that seemed incomprehensible in their relative leniency. The barracks were heated adequately, with actual coal provided regularly even as American civilians faced rationing. Medical care was available and competent. The camp hospital treated injuries and illnesses with the same standards applied to American soldiers. There was access to recreation, to reading materials, to religious services for those who wanted them. Guards maintained order without brutality, following protocols that emphasized supervision rather than punishment. When violations occurred, attempts to escape, assaults between prisoners, theft, consequences were measured and procedural rather than arbitrary and violent. This was not the chaotic cruelty they had expected, but something far more destabilizing: bureaucratic indifference executed with mechanical efficiency. The camp library contained German-language newspapers and magazines, though all were carefully screened to exclude Nazi propaganda. These publications presented a version of the war that contradicted everything the prisoners had been told. They read about the liberation of concentration camps, about the systematic murder of European Jews, about the extent of Nazi atrocities in occupied territories. The initial reaction among most women was complete dismissal. This was Allied propaganda, lies designed to demoralize and break their loyalty. But the volume of evidence was overwhelming, the documentation too detailed, the photographs too specific. Some women retreated further into denial, insisting that everything was fabricated. Others began the painful process of reconsideration, of wondering whether the ideology they had served might have been built on foundations far darker than they had ever imagined. Marguerite Hoffman found herself in the second category, though she would not have admitted it for many months. She began to notice patterns in the evidence that suggested authenticity rather than fabrication. The names were too specific, the locations too detailed, the survivor testimonies too consistent in their core elements even as they differed in individual details. She read about Auschwitz and Treblinka, about Einsatzgruppen death squads in the occupied Soviet territories, about the systematic starvation of Soviet prisoners of war in German camps. These accounts clashed violently with her understanding of what Germany represented, what she had believed she was serving when she joined the Nachrichtenhilferin Corps. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. She could not simply abandon her entire worldview, could not accept that everything she had been taught was a lie, could not reconcile the Germany she loved, the Germany of Goethe and Beethoven, of Christmas markets and forest hiking paths, with the Germany described in these documents. So she did what many prisoners did: she compartmentalized. She allowed herself to doubt certain specific claims while maintaining loyalty to a sanitized version of German identity. She told herself that perhaps some atrocities had occurred, but they were aberrations, the actions of individual criminals rather than systematic policy. She insisted that the Germany she had served was not the Germany of concentration camps, even as the evidence suggested they were inseparable. But doubt, once introduced, is difficult to contain. It spreads like a slow stain, seeping into adjacent areas of certainty, weakening foundations that once seemed solid. If the propaganda had lied about the camps, what else had been lies? If German military strength had been as formidable as claimed, why had the war been lost so comprehensively? If American society was as weak and decadent as described, how had it produced the overwhelming material superiority that crushed German resistance? The pizza became, in this context, a strange kind of proof. It was undeniably excessive, undeniably wasteful by German standards, undeniably lacking in the elegant restraint that German food culture prized. But it was also undeniably abundant, undeniably satisfying, undeniably produced without apparent effort or strain by an economic system that could feed prisoners better than Germany had fed its own soldiers in the war's final years. Every Thursday evening, that slice of pizza appeared on every tray, like clockwork, proof of an industrial capacity that seemed limitless, evidence of a society that could afford to be wasteful, because it produced so much that waste became irrelevant. By late spring 1945, as Germany surrendered and the full extent of the war's devastation became clear, the women at Fort Oglethorpe began to understand what they were witnessing. News of Germany's collapse arrived through official channels and through letters from home, the latter carefully screened, but allowed to pass when they contained no security concerns. Marguerite received a letter from her mother in Stuttgart describing conditions in the city. No electricity, no running water in many neighborhoods, food rations reduced to starvation levels, buildings reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. Her mother's tone was not bitter but exhausted, the words of someone who had survived something terrible and was now simply trying to endure one more day, and then another, with no clear sense of when normal life might resume. Reading that letter, Marguerite experienced a profound disorientation. She was a prisoner in an enemy country, confined behind barbed wire, denied her freedom. Yet she was better fed, better housed, better cared for than her own mother in a German city. The ideological logic that had sustained her worldview could not accommodate this reality. According to everything she had been taught, prisoners should suffer while civilians thrived. Enemies should be crushed while allies prospered. Military defeat should bring hardship to the defeated while victory brought abundance to the victors. Instead, she found herself in a situation where the supposedly defeated enemy provided better material conditions than the supposedly superior homeland. The Thursday evening pizza, that ridiculous, excessive American creation, became the physical embodiment of this paradox. Each week, Marguerite found herself anticipating its arrival with something that she refused to call enthusiasm, but that felt suspiciously similar. She noticed that she had developed preferences. She liked the slices from the center of the pie better than the end pieces, preferred it when the cheese was especially browned, enjoyed it more when there were bits of Italian sausage mixed into the sauce. These preferences felt like betrayals, like small surrenders to American influence, like cracks in her German identity. Yet she could not deny the simple physical pleasure of eating something that tasted good, that satisfied not just hunger but something more complex, some desire for sensory pleasure that years of wartime austerity had suppressed but not eliminated. Other women underwent similar journeys. Some moved faster, embracing American culture with a convert's enthusiasm, declaring that they had never truly believed Nazi ideology, rewriting their personal histories to minimize their complicity. Others moved slower, maintaining outward loyalty to German identity while privately acknowledging doubts they shared with no one. A few refused to change at all, insisting until the end of their captivity that Germany had been right, that the war had been lost only due to betrayal and circumstance, that American victory proved nothing except the temporary triumph of material force over spiritual truth. But for most, the transformation was gradual, uneven, marked by contradictions and reversals, but moving nonetheless in a clear direction. They began to notice things about American culture they had been trained to ignore or dismiss. The casual egalitarianism between officers and enlisted personnel, so different from the rigid hierarchies of the Wehrmacht. The diversity of American personnel, black soldiers, Hispanic soldiers, Asian American soldiers, all serving together despite the very real racism that still pervaded American society. The efficiency of American logistics, the way supplies moved from farms and factories to military bases with minimal disruption. The apparent abundance of everything. Food, yes, but also clothing, medicine, fuel, all the material goods that had become desperately scarce in Germany. Fort Oglethorpe itself was a microcosm of American industrial capacity. The facility had been constructed in 1917, expanded in 1941, and now held thousands of prisoners in conditions that would have been impossible to maintain without an economic system capable of producing vast surpluses. The barbed wire fences were American steel. The guard towers were built from American lumber. The coal that heated the barracks came from American mines. The food came from American farms so productive they could feed prisoners, soldiers, civilians, and still export massive quantities to Allied nations devastated by war. Everything about the camp demonstrated a simple fact. America won because it could afford to win, because its economic capacity was so vast that even a fraction of its resources devoted to warfare overwhelmed enemies who mobilized everything they had. The ideological implications of this reality were devastating to women who had been taught that willpower and racial consciousness could overcome material disadvantage. Nazi philosophy had insisted that spiritual strength, that collective racial will, that the intangible qualities of Germanic culture would prove superior to the crude materialism of democratic societies. The war's outcome had proven this ideology catastrophically wrong. Yet accepting that fact required accepting that everything they had believed, everything they had sacrificed for, had been built on delusions. The pizza became, strangely enough, a tool for processing this cognitive crisis. It was a small thing, a trivial thing, far removed from the grand questions of ideology and national destiny. Yet precisely because it was small and trivial, it could be used to explore larger questions safely, indirectly, without the crushing weight of full self-examination. Marguerite could admit to herself that American pizza was not as disgusting as she had initially thought without feeling that she was betraying Germany. She could acknowledge that perhaps Americans understood something about food that Germans had missed without surrendering her identity as a German woman. The pizza was a bridge, a small safe space where transformation could begin without feeling like total surrender. By summer 1945, pizza night had become genuinely popular among the German women prisoners. They lined up for their portions with the same anticipation the Italian POWs had always shown. They traded their extra slices, argued about whether the version with sausage was better than the plain cheese version, complained when the kitchen staff occasionally served it underdone or overdone. In other words, they had normalized it completely, integrated it into their expectations, stopped thinking of it as foreign or strange or threatening. It had become simply food, neither especially German nor especially American, just something people ate because they enjoyed it. This normalization was complete when Marguerite found herself explaining pizza to a new arrival, a German woman who had been captured in the final days of the war, and looked at the Thursday evening offering with the same disgust Marguerite had felt 6 months earlier. "I know it looks strange," Marguerite heard herself saying, "but actually it's quite good once you get used to it. The key is to eat it while it's still hot. Try it before you decide you don't like it." She said these words without irony, without self-consciousness, as if she were simply passing on practical advice. Only later, lying in her bunk that evening, did she recognize the magnitude of what had happened. She had become an advocate for American food to another German, had spontaneously defended something American against German prejudice, had in that small moment crossed a line she had not known she was approaching. The mechanism of this transformation was not unique to food. Throughout the camp, similar processes unfolded in different domains. Women who had initially refused to speak English began using it routinely because it made communication easier. Women who had dismissed American music as degenerate jazz found themselves humming songs they heard on the camp radio. Women who had insisted that American democracy was mob rule began noticing that the camp administration operated with surprising fairness, that rules were applied consistently, that grievances could be addressed through formal channels that actually produced responses. These were not dramatic conversions but subtle erosions, the slow wearing away of certainty through repeated exposure to contradictory evidence. The camp authorities understood this process and encouraged it, though not through heavy-handed propaganda. The American approach to prisoner re-education was surprisingly subtle, based on the theory that exposure to democratic practices would be more effective than lectures about democratic values. Prisoners were allowed to form their own governance committees to address internal disputes. They were given access to uncensored information and allowed to draw their own conclusions. They were treated with consistent fairness, demonstrating that democratic principles could function effectively even in the coercive context of a prison camp. The goal was not to make them love America, but to make them doubt the ideology that had led Germany into catastrophic war. The pizza in this context was a small part of a larger strategy. It represented abundance, yes, but also choice. There were multiple meal options at most meals, allowing prisoners to select according to preference rather than accepting whatever was provided. It represented casualness. American food culture did not insist on rigid protocols of presentation and consumption, did not demand that meals be eaten in any particular way or with any particular attitude. It represented diversity. The camp menu included foods from Italian, German, Polish, and American traditions, reflecting the immigrant nature of American society rather than insisting on a single national cuisine. Every aspect of the camp's food service communicated something about the values of the society that had created it. By autumn 1945, as the war in the Pacific ended and the process began of determining what would happen to German prisoners, the women at Fort Oglethorpe had undergone profound changes. Not all changed equally, not all in the same direction, but very few remained exactly as they had been when they arrived. The ideological certainties that had sustained them through war had been weakened if not eliminated. The vision of America as culturally inferior had been complicated by direct experience of American life, even in the limited context of a prison camp. The belief in German superiority had been shattered by Germany's comprehensive defeat and by the evidence of Nazi atrocities that could no longer be dismissed as propaganda. Marguerite Hoffmann, preparing for repatriation in November 1945, found herself experiencing complicated emotions she could not fully articulate. She wanted to go home, wanted to see her family, wanted to participate in Germany's reconstruction. But she also recognized that the Germany she would return to was not the Germany she had left, and she herself was not the person who had been captured near St. Lo 16 months earlier. She had eaten American pizza every Thursday for nearly 40 weeks. She had read American newspapers, spoken American English, lived according to American routines. She had been forced to confront evidence that the ideology she served had been responsible for unimaginable crimes. She had experienced a prisoner of war camp that treated her better than her own country had treated many of its own citizens. On her last Thursday at Fort Oglethorpe, the kitchen staff prepared pizza as usual. Marguerite took her slice, sat at the long table in the mess hall, and ate slowly, savoring it consciously for the first time, acknowledging to herself that she would miss this stupid, excessive American food. Around her, other women ate their portions with similar awareness. This was an ending, a final iteration of a ritual that had somehow become meaningful despite its apparent triviality. They knew they would not find pizza in Germany, knew they were returning to a country where food was scarce and would remain scarce for years, where the abundance they had experienced in captivity would seem like a fever dream, impossible to explain to people who had not witnessed it firsthand. What these women did not know, could not have known in November 1945, was that the pizza they had learned to eat would follow them home. Not immediately, not in the ruins of occupied Germany, where survival remained the primary concern through the harsh winter of 1940, 519 for 6 and beyond. But eventually, as Germany began to recover, as American influence spread through occupied zones, as German soldiers and prisoners who had spent time in America returned with changed perspectives, American food culture would gradually infiltrate German life. Pizza would arrive in Germany in the 1950s, brought by Italian immigrants and German entrepreneurs who had learned to make it abroad. It would be modified to suit German tastes, thinner crust, less cheese, more restrained toppings, but it would remain recognizably the same food these women had first encountered with such disgust. By the 1960s, pizza would become commonplace in major German cities, no longer foreign or strange, but simply part of the available options, another choice among many in an increasingly cosmopolitan food culture. German teenagers would eat it at parties. German families would order it for casual weekend dinners. German businessmen would grab slices for lunch. And a few elderly women, former Nachrichtenhelferinnen who had spent time as prisoners in America, would occasionally encounter this food in their daily lives and remember Thursday evenings at Fort Oglethorpe. Remember the journey from disgust to acceptance to something like appreciation. Remember the larger transformation that a simple change in food preference had represented. Marguerite Hoffmann lived until 1998, dying at the age of 76 in Stuttgart, the city where she had been born and raised. She rarely spoke about her time as a prisoner of war, finding that most people were uninterested in stories about camps where prisoners had been treated well. The narrative of German victimhood in the post-war period focused on suffering, the bombing of cities, the mass expulsions from Eastern Europe, the harsh conditions of Soviet camps, and left little room for stories about American abundance and fair treatment. Yet on the occasions when she did speak about it, usually to grandchildren or to historians collecting oral histories, she mentioned the pizza. It became, in her memory, a symbol of something she struggled to articulate. The moment when certainty gave way to doubt, when ideology confronted experience and lost, when the world revealed itself to be more complex than the simple narratives of propaganda allowed. The story of German women prisoners learning to eat American pizza is a small footnote in the larger history of World War II, a trivial detail in a conflict that killed tens of millions and reshaped the global order. Yet within that small story lies a profound truth about how ideologies sustain themselves and how they ultimately collapse. Nazi ideology was not defeated primarily by military force, though military force was certainly necessary to stop the Nazi regime's crimes. It was defeated by the systematic exposure of its falseness, by the revelation that its promises were lies and its explanations were delusions. The women who arrived at Fort Oglethorpe in January 1945 had been taught that they were members of a superior race, that their suffering was meaningful because it served a glorious purpose, that material hardship was a price worth paying for spiritual fulfillment and racial destiny. They expected America to be weak, decadent, culturally inferior, populated by mongrel races who lacked the essential qualities that made civilization possible. They expected American prison camps to be brutal, to treat them with the same cruelty that Nazi camps had shown to their prisoners. Instead, they found abundance without apparent limit, casual egalitarianism that violated every principle of proper hierarchy, efficient bureaucracy that somehow coexisted with individual freedom, and food so plentiful that even prisoners ate better than German civilians. They found that American society, despite its very real flaws and contradictions, produced outcomes that Nazi Germany could not match despite all its rhetoric about will and destiny and racial consciousness. They found, in short, that the ideology they had served was not just morally wrong, though it was catastrophically morally wrong, but also practically wrong, unable to produce the outcomes it promised, unable to compete with societies organized on different principles. The pizza was never just pizza. It was evidence, physical and undeniable, that appeared every Thursday evening without fail, proof that the American economic system could produce surpluses so vast that even prisoners ate luxuriously. It was choice, representing a food culture that emphasized individual preference rather than collective discipline. It was waste, demonstrating that America could afford to be wasteful because it produced so much that efficiency became optional. It was casual, embodying an informality that suggested confidence rather than weakness. It was diverse, reflecting an immigrant society that borrowed freely from multiple traditions rather than insisting on racial purity. And most importantly, it was transformative. It changed how these women understood food, certainly, but in changing that it opened pathways for larger transformations. The woman who could admit that American pizza was not disgusting could also admit that American democracy was not mob rule. The woman who could enjoy American food could also reconsider whether American culture was really as inferior as she had been taught. The woman who could accept kindness from American guards could also question whether the racial theories that predicted American collapse were really true. This was the genius of American soft power in the World War II era, though it was not always conscious or deliberate. America won not just by outproducing its enemies militarily, but by demonstrating that its system produced better lives for ordinary people, more choices, more abundance, more freedom to pursue individual happiness rather than collective destiny. The prison camps for German POWs were not designed primarily as re-education centers, but they functioned as such anyway, simply by treating prisoners according to the principles of American law and providing them with the standard of living that American logistics could easily supply. For every Marguerite Hoffman who returned to Germany with changed perspectives, there were thousands more who had similar experiences. German prisoners worked on American farms and saw agricultural productivity that seemed impossible by European standards. They worked in American factories and witnessed assembly line efficiency that explained how America produced so many tanks, planes, and ships. They interacted with ordinary Americans and discovered that the propaganda's portrait of a weak, mongrelized society bore no resemblance to the confident, capable people they actually encountered. They ate American food, lived in American-built barracks, received American medical care, and experienced American bureaucracy, and all of it contradicted what they had been taught to expect. The cumulative effect of these experiences was the slow dissolution of Nazi ideology in the minds of millions of Germans. Not immediately, not completely, not universally. There were many who maintained their beliefs despite all evidence, who constructed elaborate rationalizations to explain away contradictions, who retreated into denial rather than face the implications of what they had witnessed. But for many, the foundation of certainty cracked, doubt entered, and the process of transformation began. It might start with something as simple as a slice of pizza, but once started, it was difficult to stop. In the end, the story of German women prisoners learning to eat American pizza is really a story about freedom. Not the abstract freedom of political philosophy, but the concrete freedom of being able to choose what to eat, how to live, what to believe, without the state dictating every aspect of existence according to ideological imperatives. Nazi Germany had offered its people a vision of freedom too, freedom from the chaos of democracy, from the corrupting influence of international capitalism, from the supposed degeneracy of modern culture. But that freedom was revealed to be a prison, a system that demanded total submission in exchange for the promise of collective glory that never arrived. American democracy, for all its failures and contradictions, offered something different. Not perfection, not an end to suffering, not the elimination of hardship, but the possibility of building a decent life through individual effort, the chance to make choices about how to live, the protection of law rather than the arbitrary power of rulers. These were modest promises compared to the grand visions of totalitarian ideologies, but they were promises that could actually be kept. that produced real improvements in real lives, that created societies where even prisoners ate pizza on Thursday evenings. The women who learned to eat that pizza, who made the journey from disgust to acceptance to enjoyment, who returned to Germany carrying memories of American abundance, were witnesses to a fundamental truth about human society. Systems that respect individual choice, that allow for diversity and dissent, that produce abundance through free exchange rather than coerced labor, that protect rights rather than demanding sacrifice, ultimately create better lives for more people than systems built on racial destiny and collective submission to state power. This truth was not obvious in 1933, when Hitler came to power and millions of Germans embraced Nazi ideology with genuine enthusiasm. It was not obvious in 1940, when Germany dominated Europe and Nazi victory seemed inevitable. It was not even obvious in 1943, when the tide of war began to turn but outcomes remained uncertain. It became obvious only in defeat, when German soldiers and civilians could compare the promises of Nazi propaganda with the reality of Nazi outcomes, when they could see that the societies they had been taught to despise had produced something their own society had not: abundance, stability, and the possibility of ordinary happiness. A slice of pizza, appearing reliably every Thursday evening in a Georgia prison camp, was a small symbol of that larger truth. It represented a society that could afford to feed its enemies generously, that could produce surpluses without apparent strain, that could turn the act of eating into a moment of individual choice and simple pleasure rather than collective sacrifice and ideological demonstration. It was never just food. It was evidence, transformation, and ultimately liberation. The liberation that comes from recognizing that the